He came to Willow Harbor with nothing but a toolbox, a loyal dog, and a weary heart. Mark Whitman, a 60-year-old veteran and small-town realtor, thought he was just helping an old woman fix her leaking roof. But when she passed away and left him her weather boathouse by the bay, his life took a divine turn. Hidden beneath its floorboards was a secret from World War II, a forgotten promise that could save the harbor from greed. What began as an act of kindness became a journey of faith, love, and redemption. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The rain over Willow Harbor came sideways that afternoon, carried by a cold wind that smelled of pine and rusted docks. Mark Sullivan eased his old pickup down the narrow coastal road, wipers groaning, boots muddy from a morning property survey. The gray waves slapped against the pilings like impatient hands, and even his German Shepherd, Ace, stirred uneasily in the passenger seat. Mark was 60, tall and lean, with a weathered face that bore the map of a life spent outdoors, creases near his eyes where laughter used to live, a faint scar beneath his chin from his army years in the desert. His salt and pepper hair, trimmed short, curled damply under his brown cap. He'd been a realtor for 15 years since leaving the service, selling modest homes to quiet families across northern Maine. To most, he was calm, polite, and dependable, but inside there was always the low hum of restlessness, the kind that never quite leaves men who have heard too much wind and silence. Ace was 6, a powerful black and tan shepherd with an intelligent gaze and a slight tear in his right ear, a memento from his brief stint in a search and rescue unit before Mark adopted him. He sat upright now, ears flicking toward the storm, amber eyes sharp, tail still, a soldier's composure in a dog's body. They were meant to reach the town of Camden by dusk, but as the rain worsened, Mark saw the glimmer of a red roof and the faint outline of a boathouse down a side road. Smoke curled weakly from a crooked chimney. He slowed, reading the wooden signs swaying on a rusted chain, Whitaker's Boat Shed. He hadn't planned to stop, but the engine coughed twice in protest, and the next thing he knew, he was steering toward the old dock. The place looked forgotten, boards warped by years of salt, a porch light dangling by a single wire. But beneath the smell of rot and seawater was something gentler, lavender oil, maybe, and wood polish. Mark climbed out, rain lashing his coat, and Ace jumped down beside him. From inside came a muffled voice, thin and crackling. "Who's out there?" He stepped under the overhang. "Just passing through. Sorry to bother you. Your roof's leaking bad over the doorway. Thought I'd help patch it before it gets worse." The door creaked open. Standing there was Ada Whitaker, a tiny woman of 96 with snow-white hair pinned into a loose bun. Her back was straight despite her age, and her eyes, pale blue, nearly translucent, studied Mark as though reading an old book she had nearly forgotten. She wore a faded wool shawl and slippers that looked hand-knitted half a century ago. "People don't fix roofs they don't live under," she said dryly. Mark smiled, wiping water from his beard. "Old habits. I was a repairman before I started selling houses. Guess I still notice leaks." "Or you just can't stand seeing things fall apart," she said. And then, after a moment, "I used to know men like that." Ace gave a soft whine, sniffing the air around her doorway. Ada peered down. "And who's this soldier?" "This is Ace. He's better at reading people than I am." "Well, I hope he likes tea. Come in before the rain pulls you apart." Inside, the boathouse was half home, half museum, walls lined with brass lanterns, model ships, and framed black and white photographs of the harbor decades ago. A small pot of chamomile tea steamed on the stove. Mark hung his jacket, feeling the sudden warmth seep into his bones. Ada moved slowly but deliberately, her steps steady as if she'd spent a lifetime walking decks that never stood still. "You from around here?" she asked, handing him a chipped mug. "Not exactly. I'm helping a client list a property over at Birch Point. Thought I'd take the scenic route." "Scenic route in a storm," she muttered, amused. "You sound like a man trying to get lost on purpose." Mark chuckled, but the words struck closer to home than he liked. He'd been drifting more these days, taking contracts in far-off towns, staying in cheap motels. It wasn't the money. It was the silence of his own house back in Bangor, the empty chair at the breakfast table since his wife passed 3 winters ago. Ada settled into her rocker. "You've got that look," she said suddenly. "Same one my late husband had after the war. The wind never stops blowing in your head, does it?" Mark glanced at the window. No, ma'am. Guess it doesn't. The storm worsened as night fell, pounding against the roof like a drum. Mark couldn't bring himself to leave an old woman alone in that weather. He found spare shingles in the back shed, climbed up, and with Ace standing watch below, began to patch the worst of the leaks under his flashlight's weak beam. His hands were stiff, his breath steaming, but something about the work felt right, simple, honest, necessary. When he climbed down, soaked and shivering, Ada was waiting with a towel and a grin. "You fix roofs as if the world depends on it." "Sometimes it does," he said softly. She studied him a long moment, then said, "When the wind changes, people ought to change with it, but most just hold tighter to what's breaking." He didn't know why the words struck him so hard, maybe because they sounded like something his wife, Anne, would have said. He nodded, unable to speak. That night, Ada insisted he stay. "Too late to drive. The guest room's got a heater older than you, but it works." Ace curled up beside the bed, tail flicking. Through the thin wall, Mark could hear Ada humming some tune older than the harbor itself. He lay awake, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling, thinking about the way she had said change with the wind. He'd built a life around avoiding change, selling homes to others while refusing to live in one himself. 3 days passed before the weather cleared. Mark had helped Ada replace 2 window panes, fixed a jammed door, and learned she'd lived there since 1949. Her husband, Harold, a shipwright, had died building boats for the Navy. She had no children left, only the stories she told and the house that listened. On the morning of the 4th day, he woke to find the kettle cold and the house silent. Ada sat in her rocker, shawl draped neatly, eyes closed as if still mid-conversation. She had gone as gently as candle smoke. The funeral was small, just a handful of townsfolk and a lawyer from the county. Mark stood to the side, hat in his hands, Ace resting by his boots. As the minister finished, the lawyer, a brisk man in a tweed coat, approached Mark. "Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Whitaker left a letter for you. Seems you made quite an impression." The envelope was yellowed, the handwriting delicate. Inside were a short note and a folded document. "To Mark Sullivan, who fixes what he does not own. Keep the house by the water, number 17. Keep it safe for the small voices of this harbor. Ada Whitaker." He read it twice, heart thudding. The deed bore his name. Later that evening, he returned to the boathouse, key trembling in his hand. The sunset bled orange across the viney windows. Ace trotted ahead, nose low to the ground. The air smelled different now, damp wood and something metallic. Mark crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" Ace's ears pricked. He padded toward the back wall, sniffing at the old vent grate near the floorboards. It was sealed over with fresh putty, too new for this old house. Mark frowned, scraping a thumb across the edge. Beneath the putty was a faint scorch mark, like something had been burned or hidden. He felt the wind shift through the cracked window, whistling softly through the house that was now his. Ace gave a low growl, deep and uncertain. Mark whispered, "What in God's name did we just inherit, boy?" And somewhere under the floor, a hollow echo answered, a sound like the slow breath of something that wasn't quite gone. The morning after the storm, Willow Harbor looked reborn. The air was crisp, the sea mirror calm, and sunlight spilled through low clouds like a second chance. Mark stood on the porch of boathouse number 17, coffee in hand, Ace beside him, sniffing the air with the slow satisfaction of a soldier off duty. The gulls had returned, circling the docks where seaweed still clung to the posts. And in the silence between waves, Mark felt both peace and unease. The strange vent he had found last night still bothered him. By noon, he decided to clean the place properly. The floorboards creaked under his boots, each groan a reminder of age and history. Ace prowled ahead, nose low, tail stiff. When Mark lifted a warped rug by the kitchen wall, Ace began pawing at a loose plank, whining softly. "What is it, boy?" Mark murmured, kneeling. The board came up easily, too easily, as if it had been removed before. Beneath lay a shallow compartment, and inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, was a small tin box with rusted corners. Mark pried it open carefully. Inside were a handful of postcards, a folded map, and an odd brass key shaped like the hand of a clock. The postcards were dated between 1942 and 1904, each addressed to Ada and signed H.W. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink faded by salt air. The map showed the shoreline of Willow Harbor marked with tiny symbols, a seed, a lantern, a bell. The brass key gleamed faintly in the light, the kind once used to wind old tower clocks. Ace sneezed, pawing at the cloth again. "You've got good instincts," Mark said, tucking everything carefully into a satchel. He felt that strange flutter again, the quiet thrill of discovery paired with the ache of loss. Ada hadn't just left him a house, she'd left a story waiting to be finished. That afternoon, Mark drove into town. Willow Harbor's main street looked like time had stalled sometime around 1975. Painted signs, brick storefronts, fronts, and a flag that fluttered above the old post office. The library stood across from a bakery, its pale blue shutters slightly crooked. Inside smelled of lemon oil, paper, and sea dust. Behind the front desk sat Eileen Hart, the town librarian. She looked to be in her late 50s, tall and slender, with chestnut hair streaked silver and tied back loosely. Her skin had that soft, freckled fairness of someone who had spent half her life near the sea. When she looked up from a stack of index cards, her hazel eyes were kind but steady, like a person used to reading both books and people. "Morning," Mark said, setting his hat on the counter. "I'm looking for property records from the 1940s. Something about conservation land near Willow Harbor." "Most of those were archived during the war bonds program," she replied, her voice smooth but carrying the faint rasp of someone who'd laughed a lot once, long ago. "They should be in the town ledgers, unless the salt air ate them first." She paused, glancing at him. "You're the one who moved into Ada Whitaker's place, aren't you?" Mark nodded. "Yes, ma'am. She left it to me unexpectedly." Eileen's expression softened. Ada was one of the last of the seed ladies, women who ran the town's heritage seed exchange during the war. They believed every seed saved was a promise to rebuild. "My grandmother worked with her." "That explains the map I found," Mark said. "It's got little seed symbols drawn near the bay." Eileen tilted her head, intrigued. "Mind if I take a look?" Mark unfolded the map across the desk. She leaned in close, tracing the symbols with a careful fingertip. These were markers for the community plots. But this area here, she pointed to the cove marked number 17, was supposed to be part of the Birch Bay Conservation Fund. The paperwork vanished after 47. Some say the files were destroyed in a flood. Others whisper they were taken. "Taken?" Mark frowned. Eileen smiled faintly. "It's a small town. We collect mysteries like other folks collect shells." They spent the afternoon poring through drawers of brittle records. Eileen worked with quiet focus, the kind of woman who made silence feel companionable rather than lonely. Every so often she'd make a wry comment that drew a reluctant grin from Mark. There was a gentleness about her, but also a resilience, like driftwood polished smooth by time. He learned that she'd lost her husband, a fisherman, 20 years ago in a winter storm. "After that," she said, arranging a folder, "books that were easier company. They don't drown, and they never stop talking if you listen close enough." Mark understood that kind of grief, the way it reshapes your days into smaller, quieter ones. By the time the light through the window turned honey-colored, Eileen finally found a reference card stamped Birch Bay, Preservation 1904, Restricted Access. She frowned. Restricted means someone sealed it by order of the town council. That's unusual. Usually only financial records get sealed, not conservation ones. Mark folded his arms. Could someone have buried it intentionally? "Possibly," she said, "especially if there was value in that land." Her tone changed slightly, more cautious now. "Have you heard about Gregory Stanton?" Mark shook his head. Eileen sighed, resting both hands on the counter. "He's a developer from Portland, owns half the marinas along the coast. Word is, he's coming to next month's council meeting to pitch an expansion, the Willow Harbor Marina project. They say it'll bring jobs and tourism, but it'll also mean buying up shoreline. Guess where the proposed central docking point is?" Mark already knew the answer. "My place?" "Exactly. House number 17 sits on what they're calling the Golden Strip. If your deed's connected to the old preservation fund, that would make it inconvenient for them." Ace, who had been lying quietly by the door, gave a soft grunt, as if he too disapproved. Eileen chuckled. "Smart dog. He can smell trouble, can't he?" "He's better at it than I am," Mark said, half smiling. She looked at him a moment longer than necessary. "Be careful, Mark. Developers don't like mysteries unless they can pave them." He thanked her and promised to return the next day to help cross-reference the fund records. When he stepped outside, the sun was setting, turning the water copper. Ace trotted ahead, ears twitching. The street was quiet, the kind of small-town quiet that could either comfort or unsettle depending on what you carried inside. As they reached the truck, Mark noticed a figure watching from across the street, a tall man in a charcoal suit, hair slicked back, hands tucked neatly in his pockets. His expression was unreadable, but when their eyes met, the man smiled just slightly, as if recognizing him. Then he turned and disappeared into an idling black sedan. Mark stood still, pulse ticking. "That can't be good," he muttered. Back at the boathouse, night had fallen. The lantern on the porch flickered as the tide rolled in. Mark unpacked the tin box again, laying the postcards and key on the table. Ace circled once, then froze, staring at the far corner of the room. "What is it now?" Mark whispered. Ace growled softly, the sound low and steady. Mark followed his gaze, to the wall near the old radio cabinet. The cabinet door hung slightly ajar, though Mark was certain he'd shut it that morning. He stepped closer, reaching for the flashlight. Inside the cabinet was a dust-coated radio set, the kind used in wartime ships. Its dial glowed faintly, even though it wasn't plugged in. Mark frowned, kneeling. The brass key in his hand felt suddenly warm. Ace's growl deepened. Then the radio crackled to life, static and whispers bleeding through the silence. A woman's voice, faint but distinct, drifted from the speaker, soft, fragile, and familiar. "When the wind changes, hold fast to what's true." Mark froze. It was Ada Whitaker's voice. The static deepened, swallowing the words. The light flickered out. He and Ace stared at the dark radio, the silence pressing heavy as the tide beneath them. The storm came back without warning. By midnight, Willow Harbor was cloaked in fog so thick it blurred the world into shifting shades of gray. Rain drummed against the boathouse roof like restless fingers, and the tide pushed up against the pilings, making the whole structure creak and sway. Mark sat by the kitchen table, the brass clock key lying before him, turning it over in his hands. Ace slept near the door, paws twitching, as if chasing ghosts in his dreams. The faint smell of salt and damp rope filled the air. Mark had not told anyone about the radio or the voice that came through it. He wasn't sure what to believe himself. Maybe it was interference, maybe a trick of the storm, but the words had felt too pointed, too personal. "Hold fast to what's true." He stared into the flickering lantern light and wondered if Ada had left more for him than deeds and memories. Outside, the wind shifted again. Ace's ears flicked. Then, without a sound, the dog stood up, hackles raised. Mark froze. Ace's growl was low, steady, like thunder under the floor. "What is it, boy?" Ace padded to the window, nose pressed to the glass. The fog was thick, but through it, Mark saw movement near the dock, a faint glimmer, the flash of a lantern, then the unmistakable scrape of footsteps on wet planks. Someone was out there. He rose quietly, taking the flashlight and his old service knife from the drawer. "Stay close," he whispered. The moment he opened the door, a gust of rain slapped his face. The dock was slick, shining under the weak beam of the flashlight. He moved slowly, boots whispering against the boards. Ace was a shadow beside him, alert but silent. Then, beneath the stairs leading down to the tide, he caught a smell, sharp, chemical. He crouched. A rag was wedged between the beams, soaked and reeking of gasoline. His stomach turned cold. Someone had meant to burn the place. He yanked the rag free and hurled it into the rain, stamping hard to scatter the small flicker of flame that had begun to catch. Just then, an engine roared to life. Mark swung the light toward the water. A small motorboat sped off into the mist, its wake cutting through the dark like a wound. He caught only a glimpse of a shadowed figure at the helm before it vanished toward the far side of the harbor. Ace barked once, sharp and furious. Mark cursed under his breath, heart pounding. When the echo of the engine died, he spotted something gleaming near the steps. A small metal tag, half buried in the mud. He picked it up, a silver rectangle engraved with Stanton Marine, property ID 049. He stood there in the rain, the tag cold against his palm, realization settling like a stone in his gut. By morning, the storm had passed. The world looked deceptively calm. Sunlight on wet docks, the smell of seaweed rising as the tide went out. Mark hadn't slept. He sat on the porch steps with a cup of bitter coffee while Ace lay at his feet, chin on his paws, still, watchful. The crunch of tires on gravel made him look up. A black SUV rolled to a stop beside the gate, and out stepped Gregory Stanton. In daylight, the man looked even more imposing than he had across the street. Tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed dark gray hair and a tan that spoke of expensive leisure. His charcoal suit looked out of place among the weathered boards and salt air. His expression was calm, courteous, and utterly insincere. "Mr. Sullivan," he greeted smoothly, buttoning his jacket as he approached. His voice had the practiced warmth of someone who spent a lifetime turning threats into pleasantries. "I heard you've inherited the Whitaker property. I thought it'd be neighborly to stop by." Mark kept his face neutral. "Appreciate that. Not many neighbors drop in after midnight." Stanton's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed a fraction. "You've got a sharp sense of humor. I like that. Mind if I come in?" Ace rose and stepped forward, standing squarely between them. Stanton hesitated, glancing down at the dog's bared teeth. "Maybe we'll talk right here," Mark said quietly. "Fine by me." Stanton clasped his hands. "You've got a lovely piece of shoreline, historic even, but also exposed. Not the safest place to live alone, especially with how unpredictable these storms have been. I could make you an offer, fair, generous, immediate. My company's expanding the harbor facilities, and your land happens to sit right on the access point. You'd be doing yourself a favor." Mark studied him. "Funny, I found something with your company's name on it last night, right under my dock. Care to explain?" A flicker crossed Stanton's face before he recovered. Likely a worker dropped it. We run maintenance all along the coast." "In the middle of the night?" Stanton's smile turned thin. "Tides don't keep office hours, Mr. Sullivan." Ace growled softly, tail stiff. Mark took a step closer. "You and your men stay off my property." "Or what?" Stanton's voice lowered just slightly, the polish cracking. "You'll sick the dog on me?" Mark's eyes didn't waver. "If I have to." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant gulls and the lapping tide. Then Stanton's grin returned, brittle and bright. "You're a stubborn man. I respect that. But the wind's changing around here. You might want to change with it." He turned, brushing rain from his sleeve. "Enjoy your coffee." The SUV pulled away, leaving only tire tracks and silence behind. Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing Ace's head. "Guess we've made a friend." Later that morning, he met Eileen at the library, still carrying the metal tag in his pocket. She listened carefully, her expression tightening with each detail. "That wasn't an accident," she said finally. "Stanton's had his eyes on that bay for years. He owns the old shipyard to the east, Stanton Marine. If he's resorting to threats, it means your land stands in his way." "I can't prove anything," Mark said, showing her the tag. "Then we find proof," Eileen replied, her tone steady but eyes fierce. "You should go to the sheriff. Tom Weaver's an old friend of Ada's. He'll take this seriously." Mark nodded, pocketing the tag again. "There's something else. The brass key I found. It fits a clock mechanism." "Ada mentioned the harbor tower once, didn't she?" Eileen's expression softened into wonder. "The bell tower near the chapel. It's been locked since 1960. No one's touched it in decades. What if that's where she wanted me to look?" Eileen hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Then I suppose it's time someone climbed it." She handed him an old town map. "Here, the tower's at the north end of the harbor, right past the gardens. Be careful, Mark. And if you see Stanton again, don't try to outstare a man who's used to buying everything he sees." Mark smiled slightly. "I'm not for sale." That evening, he walked back toward boathouse number 17, with Ace trotting beside him, the sun setting behind the hills in molten gold. For a brief moment, peace returned, until he noticed a shape moving along the far dock. Someone was there again, watching. But when he called out, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving only wet footprints on the planks, footsteps that ended abruptly at the water's edge. Ace barked once, sharp and wary. Mark stared at the empty spot, the rippling surface reflecting a red-gold sky. Somewhere beneath, secrets waited, buried deep, like roots under old wood, and from the house behind him, faint but unmistakable, came the slow, deliberate chime of a clock striking once, though no clock in the house had been wound. The next morning dawned sharp and cold, the kind of day where the horizon looked carved from steel. A storm warning rolled through the radio waves before sunrise. Early snow was coming down from the mountains, sweeping toward Willow Harbor by nightfall. The fishermen had already hauled their boats ashore, but Mark had no time to think about the weather. The brass key lay heavy in his pocket, whispering the same question again and again. What did Ada want me to find? He left Ace in the truck when he reached the Chapel Hill, its crooked steeple rising above the town like an old sentinel. The bell tower loomed behind it, stone darkened by decades of salt and storms, ivy climbing like scars along its walls. The iron door at the base was locked, just as Eileen had said. He slid the key into the rusted keyhole, and to his astonishment, it turned with a sigh, as though it had been waiting. Ace whined softly, tail flicking. "You ready?" Mark asked, opening the door. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old metal. Wooden stairs spiraled upward, each step groaning under their weight. They climbed slowly, beams of light slicing through cracks in the tower's wall. Somewhere above, something swayed and clinked faintly, like a forgotten wind chime. At the top, the great bronze bell hung silent, its surface greened by time. Cobwebs veiled the rafters. Ace sniffed the corners, then barked once, short and urgent. Mark turned. Beneath the bell's wooden base, one panel sat slightly ajar. Kneeling, he pried it loose and pulled out a cylindrical copper tube sealed with wax. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were two brittle documents wrapped in oilcloth. A copy of the Willow Bay Easement Agreement, signed 1943, and a thin ledger labeled Bay Preservation Fund, confidential. The papers were water-stained but legible. The easement marked the entire stretch of shoreline from Birch Point to Ada's property as protected land for public trust and wildlife preservation in perpetuity. And at the bottom, Ada Whitaker's name stood beside the town clerk's. Mark exhaled slowly. "You did keep your promise, Ada," he murmured. Ace wagged his tail once, as if in agreement. He carried the documents down carefully and drove straight to the library. The snow had begun to fall, thin, hesitant flakes swirling over the harbor. When he entered, Eileen was rearranging a display of seed catalogs from the 1940s, her hair coming loose from its bun. She looked up, surprised. "Mark, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," he said, setting the tube on her desk. "A miracle." They unrolled the papers together, side by side. Her breath caught as she read the signatures. "If this is genuine, it means Stanton can't legally build anything on that shore. The land's protected under federal conservation law." Mark smiled. "Then we just might have a fighting chance." They spent hours photographing, cataloging, and carefully restoring the fragile documents. When the heating system rattled to life, dust drifted through the sunlight, turning her hair into a halo of soft copper and silver. At one point she sneezed, laughing, and Mark found himself grinning like a boy who'd forgotten how. "Don't look so triumphant," she teased. "You're still covered in cobwebs." "Guess I fit right in with your archives," he said, brushing off his jacket. "Please," she said dryly. "You'd ruin my system. You'd be filed under unresolved mysteries." They both laughed, an easy, unforced sound that echoed warmly in the quiet room. When their eyes met, the moment lingered. There was something familiar in her smile, something that steadied him, as if the two of them had been walking parallel paths all along, waiting for them to cross. By late afternoon, the snowfall had thickened. Eileen pulled on her gray scarf and went to the window, watching the harbor vanish into white. "The radio says the snow could turn into a full blizzard by night. The coastal lines are already down." Mark frowned. "I'll set up my old field transmitter at the boathouse. It can reach the marine channels if the main relay fails." "That'll help," she said, nodding. "I'll coordinate with the church to use their loudspeakers for town alerts. Old Father Doyle won't say no. He thinks any storm is the Lord's way of making him relevant again." Mark chuckled. "I'll take the west side of the bay. You handle the town square?" "Deal," she said, extending her hand. He took it, warm, calloused, steady. The handshake lingered a beat too long, and when they finally let go, the air between them felt charged, like the space before thunder. That evening, the first true gusts arrived. Snow slanted hard across the harbor, erasing every familiar shape. Mark had the transmitter rigged by the window, its green light blinking like a heartbeat. Static hissed through the air, but the message finally pushed through. "All residents advised to remain indoors, roads closing by midnight." He glanced at Ace. "Looks like it's you, me, and the wind again." But before he could settle, the transmitter crackled with a faint new voice, high and frightened. "Can anyone hear me? This is Maddie, by the marsh. I can't find the trail." Mark froze. Maddie was Eileen's niece, maybe 12, a lively girl he'd met once at the cafe, a small, freckled whirlwind with red braids and a curious mind. He remembered her fascination with Ace, how she'd said, "I want a dog like him when I'm old enough to rescue something." "Repeat your location," Mark said into the mic, but the signal broke off into static. Ace stood, ears rigid. He grabbed his coat, strapping the flashlight to his chest. The wind howled against the shutters. "She's out near the marshlands," he muttered. "If she's still moving, she won't last long in this." At that moment, the door burst open. Eileen stood there, hair damp with snow, face pale. "Did you hear her?" she gasped. "Maddie, she and her friend went birdwatching before the storm hit. I can't reach them." Mark's decision was instant. "You stay here and keep the signal open. I'll take Ace and go north along the creek. If she tries to head back, she'll follow the shoreline lights." Eileen grabbed his arm. "Mark, it's suicide out there." He met her eyes. "I've been through worse, and Ace can track in anything." For a moment, neither moved. The wind pushed hard against the windows, rattling the glass like a warning. Then she whispered, "Bring her home." He nodded once and pulled the door shut behind him. Snow whipped through the air in spirals. The world narrowed to a tunnel of white and wind. Mark moved carefully along the frozen boardwalk, Ace leading, nose low, tail stiff. Every few yards the dog paused, sniffing, then pressed forward again. The marsh stretched ahead, a labyrinth of ice and reeds whispering like ghosts. They reached the first clearing when Ace barked sharply, darting toward a cluster of reeds. Mark followed, flashlight slicing through the storm. Something glinted near the ground, a red mitten half buried in snow. He picked it up, his chest tightening. Ace began circling, barking louder. Then, from beyond the reeds, came a faint, wavering cry. "Over here!" Mark shouted, plunging forward into the wind. The story of that night would spread through Willow Harbor for years, though no one but Mark and Ace would know every detail. But for now, as the snow swallowed his footprints and the wind carried the sound of the chapel bell across the frozen biz, he pressed on, guided only by the dog's steady bark and the promise he'd made. The storm came alive like a living beast. Wind howled across the frozen bay, rattling the docks and bending the pines till they looked like bowing silhouettes in white fog. Mark pressed forward into the wall of snow, every step swallowed by the blizzard. The beam of his headlamp barely reached past Ace's tail. The German Shepherd moved with deliberate precision, low, steady, nose close to the ground, ears twitching beneath the roar. "Find her, boy," Mark murmured through his scarf. "Find Maddie." Ace's bark answered once, short and sharp. The snow whipped in waves, erasing any sense of direction. The world had narrowed to wind, ice, and the sound of his own heart pounding against his ribs. He clipped a safety line to his belt, an old paracord from his army days, and fastened the other end to Ace's harness. "You lead, I'll follow." The rope strained each time the dog surged ahead, following something invisible but certain. Mark's mind kept flashing back to the last time he'd moved through a whiteout. Years ago, Afghanistan, a dust storm instead of snow, his squad trying to locate a downed pilot. They had found him, alive, half buried, clinging to his radio. That day, Mark learned the sound of a human voice through static could drive a man through hell itself. Now it was Maddie's voice he heard in the memory of static, small, scared, trembling. "Uncle Mark, I can't find the trail." They reached the old lumber path, long abandoned, its planks hidden beneath a sheet of ice. Few in town even remembered it existed. It was the shortcut loggers once used to haul cedar from the marsh to the sawmill. Mark had walked it decades ago as a boy, before the bay turned into tourist cottages and half-finished dreams. Ace suddenly stiffened, nose lifting. A faint glow flickered through the snow ahead, orange, low to the ground. Mark crouched behind a fallen birch, shielding his light. Through the haze, he saw a shallow pit in the snow, embers dying out beneath damp branches. Someone had lit fires here, small, spaced apart, like markers. But one thing didn't fit: tire ruts beside them, deep and fresh. "Who'd be out here burning anything in a storm?" he muttered. Then the truth struck cold. Someone had tried to destroy tracks. The smell of gasoline lingered faintly beneath the smoke. Ace growled low, the fur along his spine bristling. Mark stepped closer to the pit. The edge of the ice cracked under his boot with a warning groan. He flinched back just in time as the sheet fractured completely, plunging into black water below. Ace lunged, grabbing the back of Mark's coat with his teeth, pulling him away from the collapse. The dog's strength was astonishing. 6 years of canine training burned into every instinct. Mark fell backward into the snow, panting, heart pounding. He reached out, gripping Ace's collar. "Good boy. You just saved my hide again." He shone his light across the hole. Beneath the broken ice, something metallic glinted. an oil can, maybe two. So, the fires were deliberate, and whoever set them wanted this part of the marsh to vanish. They pressed on, following the faint trail of footprints leading deeper into the reeds. The wind screamed between them. Ace barked twice, then stopped, ears pricked. From somewhere ahead came a faint whimper, barely audible above the storm. "Maddie," Mark shouted. "It's Mark! Call out!" The answer came after a long pause, fragile and broken. "Here, I'm under the bridge." They stumbled forward, following the sound until the outline of the old footbridge appeared through the snow. Half of it had collapsed into the creek below, frozen beams jutting at awkward angles. Underneath, a small shape huddled against the icy support beams. Mark slid down the embankment on his knees, Ace close behind. "Maddie, I've got you." The girl was trembling, her cheeks raw from the cold. Her red braids were stiff with frost, and the scarf around her neck was torn. She looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. "Uncle Mark?" He smiled, his voice breaking. "That's right, kiddo." He stripped off his outer coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're safe now." Ace nosed against her hands, licking the frost from her gloves. The dog's warmth was immediate, grounding. "He's huge," Maddie whispered, smiling weakly. "I knew you'd bring him." Mark pulled her close and rubbed her arms. "We're heading home. Can you walk?" She shook her head. "My ankle. It hurts." He nodded once. "Then I'll carry you." He slung her onto his back, tightening his grip under her knees. The rope connecting him to Ace now became a lifeline guiding them through the storm. Every step was agony, the wind biting his face, snow searing his lungs. But each time he faltered, he felt the soft tap of Maddie's breath against his neck and pushed forward. Halfway up the ridge, the distant toll of a bell rose through the blizzard, 3 slow, steady chimes. Eileen, she was at the chapel, ringing the old bell to guide them home. Each sound rolled through the storm like a heartbeat, echoing across the frozen fields. "Almost there," Mark muttered. "Just follow the sound." Ace barked back at the bell as if answering. They moved uphill, guided by that metallic pulse. The light from the town's edge flickered faintly through the curtain of white. Then, out of the swirling snow, headlights appeared, 2 beams cutting through the dark. A truck skidded to a halt beside the chapel steps. From it emerged Robert Stanton, coat whipping in the wind. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his once polished appearance frayed by worry. His gray hair was damp with snow, and the lines around his mouth were deepened by something that looked more like regret than pride. "Mark?" he called, disbelief cracking his voice. When he saw the girl on Mark's back, he froze. "Maddie, my God." Eileen rushed from the doorway, her raincoat flapping, eyes wide with tears. She ran straight into Mark's arms, helping ease Maddie down. "You found her!" she cried, brushing the snow from the girl's face. Mark could barely answer, too winded to speak. Ace stood beside him, chest heaving, steam rising from his fur. The sheriff's truck pulled up next. Sheriff Dalton Reeves, square-jawed and steady, his tan jacket dusted white. "We got your signal," he shouted over the wind. "Ambulance is on the way." Stanton dropped to one knee beside Maddie, voice trembling. I didn't know she'd gone out. I thought she was with her aunt." He looked up at Mark, eyes filled with something like shame. "You went out there in this weather, for my niece." Mark met his gaze, exhausted but calm. "She's Eileen's family," he said simply. "That makes her mine, too." For a long moment, no one spoke. The storm howled around them, but the sound of the bell still carried faintly above it, steady, resolute. When the medics arrived, they lifted Maddie gently into the back of the vehicle. She reached out for Ace before they closed the doors. "He found me," she whispered. "He didn't give up." Mark smiled, kneeling to stroke the dog's fur. "Neither did you." The ambulance lights faded into the night, red against white. Stanton stood there, motionless, watching it disappear. Finally, he turned to Mark and Eileen. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "About Ada's land, and what my company did." But before he could continue, another gust swept through the square, silencing them all. The storm wasn't done yet, and neither was the truth it carried. The storm had passed, leaving Willow Harbor blanketed in silence and frost. Morning sunlight fractured across the ice, painting the docks in pale gold. The town gathered at the community hall, its wood-paneled walls still smelling faintly of salt and coffee. It was the kind of meeting that decided whether a place kept its soul, or traded it for a future made of glass and profit. Mark sat near the front, his hands clasped, the old field jacket draped over his knees. Ace lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, amber eyes calm but alert. Beside Mark, Eileen adjusted her scarf and opened the worn binder that contained the Bay Fund ledger and Ada Whitaker's hand-signed easement documents. The papers trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear, but from the gravity of what they meant. The crowd murmured as Robert Stanton stepped onto the stage. His suit was immaculate, but his face bore the marks of a sleepless night. He looked older than before, shoulders slightly bent, eyes sunken with guilt. When he spoke, his voice carried the polished cadence of a businessman, but there was something raw beneath it. "Friends," he began, "we all know Willow Harbor needs work. My proposal to expand Stanton Marine wasn't meant to erase our history. It was meant to bring jobs, stability, and progress." Murmurs rippled through the room. The fishermen in the back exchanged skeptical glances. A few old-timers leaned forward, arms crossed. Mark could feel the tension coiling like a storm that hadn't quite left the bay. Eileen rose slowly. "Mr. Stanton," she said, her tone steady, but cutting through the noise like the toll of the restored bell. "Progress isn't worth much if it buries the voices of those who built this harbor. We have records that prove this shoreline belongs not to one company, but to the community." She laid the documents on the long oak table before the council. The yellowed pages caught the light. Signatures from 1943, the Gulf Conservation Easement, the names of sailors, farmers, and teachers who once donated to preserve the wetlands during wartime shortages. Gasps rippled across the hall. Sheriff Dalton Reeves, seated near the aisle, adjusted his hat and nodded. "I've verified these with the county office. The easement is real. It was just buried, same as the truth." Mark stood next, his voice lower but full of conviction. "We didn't set out to fight anyone," he said. "All we did was follow what Ada left behind. She believed the bay had its own kind of voice, quiet but persistent. If we don't listen, we'll lose more than land. We'll lose what makes this town worth living in." A murmur of approval swept the crowd. Even the fishermen at the back nodded. Then the doors opened, and a small figure walked in, Maddie, her ankle wrapped in a brace, holding onto her aunt's arm. The room fell silent. The little girl's cheeks were pale, but her eyes shone with determination. She looked toward the council table and cleared her throat. "I know I'm just a kid," she began, her voice trembling at first. "But if it weren't for Mr. Mark and Miss Eileen and Ace, I wouldn't be here today." She paused, glancing toward the dog, who wagged his tail gently, ears flicking at the mention of his name. "When the storm came, I thought I was gone, but I heard the bell. I heard home. Please don't take that sound away." Silence hung heavy, then applause broke out. Soft at first, then rising like the tide. People stood, clapping, tears glinting in their eyes. Eileen reached over, squeezing Mark's hand under the table. He felt something stir in his chest, something fragile and luminous, like hope thawing after a long freeze. Stanton remained standing, eyes locked on the girl. His jaw tightened, the facade of the businessman slipping to reveal something human. He walked slowly to the microphone. "I've made a lot of decisions in my life," he said quietly, "and most were made from behind a desk. But last night, when I saw that child pulled from the snow, I realized I'd forgotten what I was building all this for." He took a deep breath, then turned toward the crowd. "The expansion will still happen, but differently. We'll move the marina offshore, where it won't harm the wetlands, and the strip of shoreline around Boathouse 17. He hesitated, glancing at Mark. "Will be returned to the Bay Conservation Fund. I'll personally fund the restoration of the bell tower and Ada's property, to be used as an education and heritage center." A stunned silence filled the hall, followed by a wave of applause. People rose to their feet, some out of joy, others out of sheer relief. Eileen's eyes shimmered. "That's more than we hoped for," she said softly. Stanton met her gaze, then turned to Mark and extended his hand. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, the veteran who had risked his life for a town's memory, and the mogul who had nearly erased it. Then Mark rose, took his hand firmly, and said, "No one wins today, Robert. We just stopped losing the bay." Stanton nodded, a ghost of a smile flickering. "You're right. Maybe that's the first real victory we've had in years." The meeting ended not with signatures, but with something more enduring: laughter, relief, and the sound of old friends rediscovering what community meant. Outside, sunlight sparkled across the thawing ice. and the bell at the harbor rang again, clear, solemn, beautiful. Later that afternoon, as the town drifted home, Mark lingered by the dock. Ace stood beside him, nose lifted toward the breeze. Eileen approached, her hair caught by the wind, cheeks flushed. "You could have been a lawyer with that speech," she teased. "Not my style," Mark replied with a grin. "Too many suits, not enough dogs." She laughed, the sound light as the ripples on the bay. "Well, maybe you're exactly what this town needs, a man who still listens to bells." He looked at her for a long moment, the sun catching in her eyes. "Maybe what I needed," he said quietly, "was someone who believed I could hear them again." They stood side by side as the gulls wheeled overhead, the world washed clean by wind and salt. Somewhere behind them, Ace barked once, as if approving of whatever unspoken promise had just passed between them. The harbor's voice carried across the water, gentle, unbroken, alive once more. Spring crept into Willow Harbor softly, the kind of spring that still smelled faintly of sea salt and thawing wood. The ice was gone, replaced by sunlight trembling on the rippling water. From the old boathouse, now freshly painted in warm cedar and trimmed with white, came the sound of laughter and the light tapping of tools. House number 117, once a relic of forgotten tides, had become the Harbor Seed and Story House. Mark stood near the entrance, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, as he adjusted the new sign Eileen had painted herself. The letters curled in a mix of blue and gold: Harbor Seed and Story House. Trade seeds, share stories, grow together. Ace sat nearby, proudly wearing a brass badge that read Safety Companion, his furs glinting under the sun. Children ran by and stopped to pat his head, giggling when he wagged his tail like a windmill. Eileen came out carrying a tray of steaming mugs. Her gray-green cardigan fluttered in the breeze, and her cheeks were flushed from the warmth inside. "You work better when you're hydrated," she teased, handing him a mug. He took it with a smile. "And you manage this place like a general commanding joy." Inside, the boathouse had transformed. Wooden shelves held jars of seeds labeled by hand: tomato, 1942, strain, lavender, coastal bloom, oak, Ada's Grove. The back wall displayed framed photos, soldiers smiling beside gardens, fishermen with their first harvest, Ada Whitaker standing proudly by the bell tower decades ago. Every Saturday, townsfolk came to swap seeds and stories. One corner of the room had become a circle of mismatched chairs where people gathered to talk. Farmers recalling old planting methods, veterans remembering how gardens had once fed them through war. Eileen called it the healing hour. This afternoon's class was full. An elderly woman named Mrs. Palmer, 82, with white curls and bright lipstick, told the children about her late husband, who grew sunflowers every spring. "He used to say," she chuckled, "that if a seed can push through the dirt to find the sun, so can we." Mark watched from the doorway, arms crossed, heart full. The idea for this place had started with Eileen, her way of keeping both memory and soil alive, but it had become his anchor too. The realtor who once sold forgotten properties now helped others reclaim them. Later, as the sun dipped low, the bell tower tolled across the harbor. Its sound had changed, clearer, warmer, as if the metal itself remembered why it was forged. Ace lifted his head and barked once, the deep, joyful kind that echoed off the water. That evening, the library across town was aglow. The Elder Story Circle had begun, a weekly gathering for older residents. Eileen hosted with gentle patience, coaxing stories from shy voices. Mark often sat in the back, listening to tales of youth and loss, the war years, the gardens that had long since turned to dust, but still lived in memory. One man, Henry Collins, tall and thin with a cane carved from driftwood, told of how he planted a single rosebush beside his wife's grave every spring. "She used to hum when she watered the plants," he said softly, "and I swear the roses hum back now." The crowd chuckled through tears. Eileen closed her notebook. "That's the point of this place," she said, "to remember what's worth keeping, and to pass it on." When the evening ended, the two of them walked home along the pier. The water shimmered silver beneath the moonlight. Eileen carried a small pouch of seeds she'd been sorting earlier. Oak, maple, sunflower. Mark had been unusually quiet, his hands deep in his pockets. At the edge of the dock, near where the bell's reflection quivered in the waves, he stopped. "You know," he said, "I used to think home was something you bought. Square footage, clean paint, solid roof. He turned toward her, eyes soft. But it's really just where someone waits for you to come back. She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. And here I thought you'd stop making speeches. He chuckled. Just one more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small paper packet, folded neatly. This one's different, though. She opened it. Inside was a single acorn, smooth, pale brown, resting in her palm like a promise. What's this? A seed from the old oak near Ada's land, he said quietly. I thought we could plant it here, by the bay. Let it grow slow, but strong, like us. For a moment, neither spoke. The waves lapped gently against the pier. Then Eileen looked up, eyes glistening. Are you asking me to? He nodded, smiling. Marry me, but I thought a ring was too small a thing for something this big. She laughed through tears. You're impossible. I'm patient, he said, like a tree. She closed the packet gently, holding it to her chest. Then yes, let's plant it and see if it finds its way home. Ace barked right then, perfectly timed, his tail thumping the dock as if sealing the deal. Mark and Eileen laughed, and the sound carried across the still water, blending with the soft toll of the distant bell. Weeks later, the oak seedling sprouted by the shoreline, its first leaves trembling in the sea breeze. Maddie helped water it every morning before school, calling it the hope tree. Fishermen left small stones beneath it, tokens of luck. And every afternoon, as the sun sank over the harbor, the bell rang 3 times, its sound mingling with the rustle of young leaves. Mark often said to visitors, the bay wasn't saved by grand gestures, it was saved by small, right things. A roof repaired, a bell rung, a dog that wouldn't give up. Eileen would add, smiling, and by people who remembered how to listen. As summer came, the story house thrived. Children learned how to build birdhouses, elders shared recipes long forgotten, and Ace became the town's silent guardian, patrolling the docks each dawn, as if to make sure everything stayed just as it should. On the anniversary of the storm, they held a gathering by the shore. Lanterns floated on the water, each one carrying a note of gratitude, some for loved ones lost, some for blessings found. The last lantern, shaped like a tiny bell, drifted out farther than the rest, its light steady against the dark. Mark put his arm around Eileen's shoulders. You think Ada would approve? Eileen smiled. I think she's ringing the bell for us right now. The waves whispered softly at their feet, and above them, the tower bell sang one last time that day. Deep, resonant, eternal, and beneath it, the seed that found its way home began to root deeper into the earth of Willow Harbor, carrying with it every story, every kindness, and every small act of courage that had kept the bay alive. When Mark looked back across the quiet harbor that evening, the wind was softer, the light warmer. The same place that once held his loneliness now shimmered with purpose. He had come to repair an old boathouse, but God had been repairing his heart all along. Sometimes the greatest storms aren't meant to break us, but to guide us home, to faith, to love, and to the people we were meant to become. So, if you've ever felt lost in life's tempests, remember, no storm lasts forever, and no prayer goes unheard. God may be silent for a while, but he's always steering your boat, even when the fog is thickest. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment about a moment when you felt God leading you home. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true, faith-filled stories of love, courage, and second chances. May God bless you, your family, and every faithful heart that still believes in small miracles.